Have you ever stopped to think about why some people are able to maintain a strong, stable, and living faith throughout their entire lives, while others begin with great spiritual enthusiasm but, over time, end up growing cold, becoming distracted, or losing the depth of their walk with God? This question is not new. In fact, it stretches across centuries of Christian history. And when we look at the life of John Wesley, we find an answer that may surprise many people. The secret of his spiritual strength was not only in his preaching, nor only in his theology, nor only in his courage to face criticism and persecution. What sustained his faith was something much simpler and at the same time much deeper: a rule of life, a spiritual structure that organized his routine, shaped his thoughts, disciplined his emotions, and kept his heart constantly turned toward God. This rule of life was not a religious prison, but a path to spiritual freedom. It functioned like a map that guided every part of his day, every decision, and every attitude. Wesley deeply believed that faith does not grow by accident. Faith grows when there is intention, discipline, and consistent practice. Many people wait until they feel like praying in order to pray. Wait until they feel inspired to seek God. Wait until they feel motivated to read the scriptures. Wesley thought differently. He understood that spiritual discipline does not begin with feelings, but with decision. And many times it is exactly this decision that over time creates the right feelings within the heart. At the beginning of his spiritual journey, Wesley realized something that completely changed the way he lived. He realized that the human soul is deeply influenced by daily habits. Small choices repeated over time create patterns that shape character, the mind, and spirituality. This means that faith does not depend only on great spiritual moments, such as special church services, conferences, or intense emotional experiences. Faith also depends on small daily practices that may seem simple, but have enormous impact over the years. That is why Wesley developed a clear rule of life. He organized his time, defined spiritual priorities, and established disciplines that kept his heart constantly turned toward God. This rule included specific moments for prayer, reading the scriptures, personal reflection, serving others, and examining his own heart. Each part of this routine had a spiritual purpose. It was not merely an organized schedule. It was a path to cultivate intimacy with God. One of the most impressive characteristics of Wesley's rule of life was the constant examination of his own soul. He did not allow days to simply pass without reflection. Frequently, he would stop and ask himself something very profound. How is my heart before God today? This simple question had enormous power, because many people live entire years without stopping to examine their own soul. They keep working, studying, solving problems, dealing with responsibilities, but rarely pause to evaluate their spiritual life honestly. Wesley did not accept that kind of superficiality. He knew that the human heart can easily drift, become distracted, or grow spiritually comfortable. For that reason, he created intentional moments of reflection. He observed his thoughts, his attitudes, his motivations, and his choices, not to condemn himself, but to realign himself with what God desired for his life. This kind of practice develops a very strong spiritual awareness. Gradually, a person learns to quickly perceive when something in the heart is no longer in the right place. Another essential part of Wesley's rule of life was the discipline of constant prayer. For him, prayer was not merely an occasional religious activity. It was the breath of the soul. Just as the body continually needs air, the soul continually needs communion with God. Wesley dedicated specific times for prayer, but he also cultivated an inner attitude of constant dialogue with God throughout the day. While walking, while traveling, while preparing sermons, while talking with people, his heart frequently returned to God in thought and silent prayer. This type of spirituality completely transforms the way someone lives. A person stops seeing God only in formal religious moments and begins to perceive his presence in every part of life. But there is something even deeper within Wesley's rule of life that many people overlook. He did not practice spiritual discipline only for individual growth. His spirituality was deeply connected with serving others. He believed that true faith always expresses itself in practical love. That is why his routine included visiting those in need, helping the poor, offering spiritual counsel, and providing pastoral care. For Wesley, Faith that does not turn into concrete action is incomplete. He believed that God transforms the human heart not only through prayer and reading the scriptures, but also through humble service to other people. This vision creates a very healthy spiritual balance. A person grows in intimacy with God and at the same time grows in compassion for others. Another striking element of his rule of life was the discipline of time. Wesley understood that time is one of the most valuable resources God gives to every person. For that reason, he organized his hours very carefully. He avoided wasting time, excessive distractions, and activities that did not contribute to his spiritual mission. This does not mean he lived rigidly or without joy. On the contrary, he believed that when time is used with purpose, life becomes more meaningful and full of significance. Many people today feel that days pass quickly without leaving deep spiritual fruit. Part of that happens because life becomes full of urgent activities, but empty of eternal priorities. Wesley reminds us that it is possible to live differently. It is possible to organize life in such a way that God truly remains at the center of everything. Over the years, this rule of life began producing extraordinary fruit. Wesley's faith became deeper and deeper, his spiritual vision clearer and clearer, and his influence greater and greater. He traveled thousands of miles preaching, faced severe criticism, was rejected by religious leaders, and encountered countless challenges. Even so, his faith remained firm. The reason is simple. It was rooted in solid spiritual practices. He did not depend only on temporary spiritual emotions. His faith was sustained by discipline, conviction, and a constant relationship with God. Perhaps the most important question now is this: what does this mean for us today? Does modern life, full of technology, speed, and distractions, still allow the development of a similar spiritual rule of life? The answer is yes, but it requires intention. The central principle is not copying Wesley's exact routine, but understanding the wisdom behind it. Faith needs structure. Spirituality needs concrete practices. A relationship with God needs real time. When a person decides to organize their spiritual life with purpose, something begins to change inside them. Gradually, the mind becomes more focused, the heart more sensitive, and faith more stable. Perhaps at this moment you are realizing something important within yourself. Perhaps you love God and desire to grow spiritually, but at the same time you notice that your spiritual life often becomes irregular, rushed, or superficial. If that is your case, know that you are not alone. Millions of Christians face exactly this challenge, and this is precisely where Wesley's example becomes so valuable. He shows us that spiritual strength is not born only from great experiences, but from a life organized around the presence of God. Imagine for a moment how your life could change if you began to develop your own spiritual rule of life. Not something heavy or impossible, but a simple and intentional structure. A daily time for genuine prayer, a moment to reflect on the scriptures, a space to examine your own heart, a commitment to practice concrete love toward others. Small decisions like these, repeated daily, can completely transform the spiritual trajectory of a person. And here is something fascinating. When these practices become a natural part of life, faith stops being something distant or occasional. It begins to accompany every moment of the journey. The presence of God stops being only a theological concept and becomes a reality, experienced in everyday life. Inner peace grows. Spiritual clarity increases. Decisions begin to be made with greater wisdom. Gradually, a person realizes that their entire life is being shaped by the presence of God. Perhaps this is exactly what God desires to do in your life right now. Perhaps this video did not reach you by accident. Perhaps it is a quiet invitation to reorganize your spiritual walk and build a faith that is deeper, more consistent, and more alive. If this message is speaking to your heart right now, write here in the comments a simple but powerful sentence: I want to live a spiritually disciplined life before God. This small act may mark the beginning of a real transformation. And if you want to continue learning about faith, spiritual discipline, and inspiring stories of men and women who walked deeply with God, leave your like on this video and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next reflections that can strengthen your spiritual journey even more. Because in the end, the rule of life that made John Wesley spiritually strong was not an inaccessible secret reserved only for extraordinary leaders. It was a simple path of daily faithfulness before God, and that same path remains open today for anyone who is willing to pursue it with sincerity. There comes a moment in every person's spiritual life when they must decide whether they will continue living only on occasional inspiration, or whether they will build a solid faith that can withstand time, difficulties, and the distractions of the world. It was exactly at this point that John Wesley's life took a decisive turn. He realized that many people wanted to experience God, wanted to grow spiritually, and wanted to live a holy life, but they remained trapped in a cycle of temporary enthusiasm followed by spiritual coldness. This pattern repeated constantly, and Wesley began to understand something very profound. Without a spiritual structure, even the most sincere faith can weaken over time. The human soul needs direction, it needs intention, and it needs practices that keep the heart constantly aligned with God. That is why his rule of life was not merely a set of spiritual ideas, but a daily commitment to practices that slowly shaped his inner life, day after day, year after year. One of the most remarkable things about the way Wesley lived was his constant awareness that spirituality cannot depend only on environment. Many people seek God's presence only when they are in a church service, at a conference, or in a special moment of collective prayer. These moments are important, but Wesley believed that true spiritual maturity happens when a person learns to cultivate God's presence even in ordinary days, in silent hours, and in the simple routines of life. That is why his rule of life was built around small practices repeated daily. He woke up with purpose, began the day seeking God, organized his activities with care, and maintained moments of reflection throughout the day. Each of these actions created a kind of spiritual rhythm. Just as the human heart beats continuously to keep the body alive, these spiritual disciplines kept his soul awake. Over time, something extraordinary began to happen within him. The discipline that at first required effort began to transform into joy. What was once practice became pleasure. Prayer stopped being merely a spiritual obligation and became a desired encounter. Reading the scriptures stopped being merely study and became nourishment for the soul. This is one of the most important secrets of the spiritual life that Wesley understood. When a person perseveres in spiritual practices, even when feelings are not strong, the heart is gradually transformed. The desire for God grows, spiritual sensitivity increases, and what once seemed difficult becomes a source of life. Another powerful dimension of Wesley's rule of life was his radical commitment to spiritual honesty. He refused to live a superficial spirituality. Instead of simply maintaining a religious appearance, he wanted his inner life to be truly transformed. For that reason, he frequently examined his deepest motivations. He asked himself whether his actions were being guided by love for God or by the search for human recognition. He analyzed his thoughts, his reactions, and his attitudes. This practice may seem simple, but in reality it requires great spiritual courage. Few people are willing to look inside themselves with such honesty. Yet Wesley believed that this kind of inner examination was essential for true spiritual growth. When a person recognizes their weaknesses before God, they open space for grace to transform those areas. Another fundamental element in his rule of life was spiritual fellowship with other people who also desired to grow in faith. Wesley understood that no one matures spiritually completely alone. For that reason, he created small groups where Christians met regularly to share their struggles, confess weaknesses, encourage one another, and seek together a deeper life with God. These meetings created an environment of spiritual accountability. Each person knew their journey was not isolated. There were brothers and sisters walking together, praying together, and strengthening one another. This model of fellowship became one of the foundations of the movement that would later impact thousands of people. Wesley realized that when faith is lived in community, it becomes stronger, more sincere, and more persevering. At the same time, his rule of life maintained a constant focus on mission. Wesley did not see spirituality as something turned only inward. For him, the closer a person grows to God, the more their heart becomes filled with love for the people around them. That is why he dedicated much of his time to preaching, counseling, visiting people, and proclaiming the message of the gospel. Even when he faced rejection, even when he was criticized by religious leaders, and even when he had to travel long distances under difficult conditions, he continued moving forward. The strength for that perseverance came precisely from his disciplined spiritual life. His communion with God renewed his courage. His prayer strengthened his conviction. His rule of life kept his heart steady even when circumstances were difficult. Perhaps one of the greatest lessons we can learn from this story is that true spiritual strength is rarely visible at the beginning. When someone begins developing spiritual disciplines, the results often seem small. Praying a few minutes each day may seem simple. Reading the Bible regularly may seem like a common practice. Reflecting on one's own heart may seem discreet. But over the years, these small practices build something powerful within the soul. They create deep roots. They form solid spiritual character. They develop a faith that does not depend only on external circumstances. And when the storms of life come, that faith remains firm. Perhaps at this moment you are realizing something important about your own spiritual journey. Perhaps you sincerely love God, but at the same time feel that your faith could be deeper, more consistent, and more alive. Perhaps there are days when you feel close to God and others when he seems distant. Perhaps your routine is so full of responsibilities that time with God ends up being postponed. If that happens to you, know that there is another way. Wesley's story shows us that spirituality can be cultivated intentionally. It can grow through simple habits, conscious decisions, and daily practices that keep the heart aligned with God. And here is something very important. God does not expect immediate perfection. What he seeks is a willing heart. Wesley did not become spiritually strong overnight. His journey was built over many years of faithful practice, sincere repentance, and continuous growth. Every day was a new opportunity to seek God again. Every failure was an opportunity to begin again. Every spiritual discipline was a tool to draw even closer to the Lord. Perhaps today is exactly the moment to make that decision. Not an emotional decision that lasts only a few days, but a conscious decision to build a structured, intentional, and deep spiritual life. If this message has touched your heart, write here in the comments something simple but meaningful. Today I decide to organize my spiritual life before God. This small declaration may mark the beginning of a new stage in your journey of faith. And if you want to continue learning spiritual principles that strengthen faith, awaken spiritual awareness, and help build a life closer to God, leave your like on this video and subscribe to the channel. That way you will continue receiving content that can transform the way you live your faith day by day. Because in the end, the rule of life that made Wesley spiritually strong was not merely a personal strategy. It was a path of faithfulness before God, a path that shows true spirituality grows through small decisions repeated consistently. And the good news is that this path remains open today for anyone willing to walk it with sincerity, discipline, and a heart fully turned toward God.